Hi friends, this is John Guandolo, President and Founder of Understanding the Threat, with an informational message to help all of you understand what is going on right now in America. As many of you know, in 2008, I was recruited out of the FBI to work in the Department of Defense on the strategic threat from primarily Islam, but also from the communist movement, which we were briefing to members of Congress back as early as 2009. What's important and what I want to share with you is my colleague, Steve Coughlin, had been, at the time I met him, inside the Pentagon giving a brief about the Islamic threat as well. And the brief became known as the Red Pill Brief as a joke, but seriously modeled after the movie The Matrix, where the actor, played by Keanu Reeves, is offered a red pill and a blue pill. A blue pill if they want to stay oblivious to the truth and the reality of what was going on, and the red pill if he wanted to get a dose of reality, and he chose the red pill. The point is, I call this brief the new Red Pill Brief, because this is an update on where we are and what is really going on in America today. So let's begin. Many of you who have been students, both of Understanding the Threat and the current events going on right now, are familiar with the name Yuri Bezmenov. Yuri Bezmenov worked for Soviet KGB and in 1970 defected to Canada. After his defection, he was asked if he would begin sharing some of the things he had learned and had trained others in order to do what he did for the Soviet Union. Well, what was it he did? What Yuri Bezmenov did was he brought down countries. He and others would go into a country and would follow a successful plan to bring the country down. And at the behest of others, he began, after his defection, sharing this information and eventually began teaching classes on it. Many of those classes are now on YouTube and you can watch them. This is one of the things that Yuri Bezmenov said that I'd like to begin with in this discussion. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in the country of your enemy until such a time that the perception of reality of your enemy is screwed up to such an extent that he does not perceive you as an enemy. You can take your enemy without a single shot being fired. So friends, this is what we're going to talk about today. The communist counterstate and the Islamic counterstate operate inside America today, and they are the mechanism through which a number of hostile forces inside and outside the United States are being used to bring this republic down. I want you to listen to this several-minute video by Yuri Bezmenov, and I'm going to unpack it. But here are a few things I want you to think about as you're watching the video. How does this relate to what is going on inside the United States today? And how does it follow the plan that our enemies are actually operating under, including the leadership of the National Democrat Party, other communist organizations, and the Islamic movement inside the United States?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. To change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in four basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black. You still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
These are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. Obviously they will join the links of dissenters, dissidents.
Yes.
Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. The next stage is destabilization, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation. What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. The influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world, that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. He will go to Moscow to kiss the bottoms of new generation of Soviet assassins, never mind. He will create false illusions that the situation is under control. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. The United States is in the state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. But you don't have to be paranoid about it. What actually happens now, that unlike myself, you have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to, unless you want to live in Antarctica with penguins. This is it. This is the last country of freedom and possibility.
So as you heard Bezmenov articulate, ideological subversion is the focus of what our enemies have been doing. Information warfare, political warfare, Mao's political warfare, which primarily operates and succeeds in the non-violent arena, not in the violent arena. Remember, the violence that America has seen in its streets over the last 9 months are being propagated by communist agitators. Communists from Black Lives Matter and communists from Antifa and others. But this is not the main focus of their effort. The main focus of their effort is to bring down the Republic. And intermediate to that is to change policy and affect us at a deep political, societal, and cultural level, to defund police, to keep us focused on things that our adversaries don't care anything about. They tell us they care about climate change and systemic racism and police brutality and all kinds of other things, like the health of Americans. But they do not. They care about control of the state and power. Power as an end unto itself. And that, my friends, is what we're talking about right now, how they're doing that. Keep in mind that if this is true, and it is, that means that in this war right now, it is patriotic Americans versus everyone else. And that list of people who are not with us as patriots includes many Republicans. As we begin this deeper discussion about the information war, remember this is all about controlling the narrative. And I want to begin with this quote from Ulysses S. Grant that there are two parties in America today, just like in our Civil War. There are patriots and there are traitors. And if people are confused about where they stand, they need to decide. Because in America today, we are literally fighting for the very republic itself. In controlling the narrative, our adversaries have gone to great lengths to ensure that we remain ignorant about what the communists and their movement are doing and about the jihadis, the Islamic movement here in the United States, and what they are doing. So let's begin with this. Here you see quotes from the most widely used textbook in U.S. Islamic schools, What Islam is All About. This book is used in U.S. Islamic schools at the junior high school level. That means 7th graders, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds are getting this information in the United States. And what does it teach? The basis of the legal and political system is the Sharia of Allah. The law of the land is the Sharia of Allah. This book also teaches that if anyone dies in jihad, they automatically go to paradise, and that jihad is one of the 3 duties of every Muslim, and it is primarily using physical force to impose Allah's will, Allah's divine law, Sharia, on every human being on earth. This book also says that, quote, the duty of Muslim citizens is to be loyal to the Islamic State. So here's the question. How is it possible that 11-year-old Muslim children are taught in U.S. Islamic schools something about Islam that is exactly opposite of what U.S. leaders are told by Muslim advisors and Muslim leaders about Islam? That's a good question. And let me give you an example of how this influence operation is literally destroying America's ability to wage war. When the 9/11 Commission report came out, it was filled with a lot of truth about what the threats are that we face and who is behind it, that Islamic terrorists are behind it, actually. So the Muslim Brotherhood, in the form of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, wrote a letter to the chairman of the 9/11 Commission. And the letter, in part, says this: terminology is important in defining our goals, as well as removing roadblocks into hearts and minds. The 9/11 Commission identifies Islamist terrorism as the threat. The Muslim Public Affairs Council recommends that the U.S. government find other terminology. Well, that's just a letter. And just because someone writes a letter, we don't need to worry about it, except when we look at the 9/11 Commission report and the words that were used to describe the enemy, we see this: that words like enemy and jihad and Muslim and Islam and Sharia and caliph, as in the leader of the Islamic Caliphate, are all used, as well as the names of terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda. The letter comes in, and this is what we see from U.S. doctrine in the FBI and elsewhere about strategic threats and strategic threat planning. We see that these words are completely whitewashed out of our lexicon, that we, Americans in the DHS, CIA, FBI, NSA, national security staffs, and elsewhere, like the State Department and other places, we don't use these terms because we're told by our adversary, posing as friends, suit-wearing jihadis, that these words are offensive. And so for closing in on 20 years, our enemy has actually convinced us not to address the enemy. So here's how it works. If you can't use the words that accurately identify the threat, you as a professional in the national security apparatus can never identify the threat. And if you can't identify the threat, you can never put your finger on the threat and destroy the threat. And that, my friends, is why America is losing the war at the national and international level. And now let me give you a few examples of how not knowing the enemy has been devastating to us in this war. On your screen, you're looking at Abdurahman Alamoudi, arguably the most prominent and widely known Muslim leader in America in the 1990s. He was the Islamic Advisor to President Clinton and Vice President Gore. He actually advised the Bush administration during their campaign in 2000. He was a goodwill ambassador for the State Department and participated in Middle East peace process on behalf of the United States. This man, Abdurahman Alamoudi, created the Muslim Chaplain program in the Department of Defense. Where is he now? He's in federal prison because he is a financier for Al-Qaeda and a senior Muslim Brotherhood leader in the United States. That, my friends, is a little taste of how broken, catastrophically, the United States national security apparatus is. Gulmurad Kalimov, you see on your screen right now, is an ISIS military commander who trained inside the United States thanks to the U.S. State Department. 5 times the U.S. State Department, both here in the United States and overseas, trained this ISIS commander. And the State Department boasted that this guy was vetted, which tells me a number of things. How did an Al-Qaeda financier like Abdurahman Alamoudi get to be the Islamic Advisor to President Clinton? Because obviously our vetting process is utterly and completely broken. How does Gulmurad Kalimov get trained by the State Department in military tactics? Because our vetting process is catastrophically broken. How about this one? Vahid Majidi. Anyone ever hear of him? Well, he was the FBI's assistant director for the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, and he's an Iranian-born Muslim. But don't worry, he left the FBI and went on to become the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear matters. No worries, though. He is now the director for the Savannah River National Lab, obviously working nuclear matters and everything else there. What is the point of these handful of examples? Is that our country's ability to determine friend from foe is catastrophically broken. And at a time like right now, that is devastating to our ability to win this war, to even fight this war in a productive manner. It wasn't always this way in the United States. Some of you who follow Understanding the Threat will be educated about this next little vignette. But in 1786, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams met with the ambassador from Tripoli to Great Britain, and they met him in England to discuss certain things that were going on. And what were those things that were going on? Well, Muslims were seizing U.S. ships and kidnapping American citizens. What was the response? Jefferson and Adams asked the ambassador to Great Britain from Tripoli, why? Why were Muslims of the Barbary states at this time in our history doing this? He gave his answer to them, which they recorded in a letter to the Continental Congress. The letter that they wrote remains today in the Library of Congress, and it reads as follows, in part. Islam was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. So following that, Jefferson and Adams both acquired Qurans. Thomas Jefferson got a hold of the first Quran translated into English, which was published in 1649 in London. And I'd like you to look at the very first page of that Quran. First of all, it is at the very top addressed to the Christian reader. There being so many sects and heresies banded together against the truth, finding that of Muhammad, wanting to the muster, meaning do battle, I thought it good to bring it to their colors, to bring it to their attention, that so viewing thine enemies in their full body, thou mayest the better prepare to encounter and I hope overcome them. Meaning, the very first Quran translated into English that Thomas Jefferson obtained and read was printed, translated, and published so that we might know our enemies, Muslims, and overcome them in battle, because our founders understood history. Many of you know the follow-up to that story is that when Thomas Jefferson became president, he sent the Marines into Tripoli to crush them, and therefore the United States no longer had to pay tribute to the Muslims to keep them from seizing our ships. As a matter of fact, some of you may be aware that between 20 and 25% of America's gross national product at the time was being paid to tribute. This, the war against the Muslims, was the first war America fought after the American Revolution. I share all of that with you as a historical background to where we are today. So let's keep talking about information operations and our enemy controlling the narrative, because this is the key to their victory. Let's look at one more example that I think is a tremendous example of our adversaries controlling the message, and more importantly, as the Muslim Brotherhood says they are doing, is waging civilization jihad by our hand, getting our leaders to do their bidding for them, which is exactly what the communists say they are doing. They get our leaders to regurgitate communist narratives, to sit back and do nothing, or be too ashamed to take action when they should. So when prominent Republicans regurgitate communist narratives like America is systemically racist, they're advancing the communist cause even if they don't know they are. So let's look at an example of that with regard to the Islamic counterstate. After 9/11, and quite frankly, prior to 9/11, in most cases, 4 men on the planet were crushing the Muslim Brotherhood and the Sunni Islamic Movement more than any others. Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and Bashir Assad in Syria. Remember civilization jihad by our hands. Remember that both Mr. Bush and Mr. Obama had Muslim Brotherhood leaders working with and inside their administrations. And what did we do? The United States killed 2 of those men, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, pushed one out of power, Hosni Mubarak, and continues to advance and go after Bashir al-Assad. That right there, friends, is civilization jihad by our hand. That is getting others, useful idiots, to do your bidding for them. Useful idiots being the common communist term for those who are not communists but do their bidding nonetheless. Let's go through these operations briefly. Mr. Trump was elected, and even before his election, and leaders of the U.S. intelligence community fired off an operation against him. The Russian collusion hoax, but I don't like the term hoax because that almost seems like it's something that's less offensive as it is. This was an operation directed at the President of the United States to bring him out of power. That's called a coup. This is treason and sedition, and we need to remember that. And following that failed attempt, we get the impeachment of the president with no evidence on the table other than a phone call, but no evidence that there's anything wrong done, and they're trying to impeach and do impeach the president. Why? Because this isn't about the issue. This is about control of the state and power. And let me talk for a moment about 2 of the individuals that are complicit and engaged in that coup, James Comey and John Brennan. John Brennan, who publicly admitted he voted for the Communist Party candidate before he joined the CIA. John Brennan, who while in Saudi Arabia as the CIA's station chief, said the Shahada in front of Saudi government officials, including intelligence officers, which means he converted to Islam while he was the CIA station chief. And James Comey, the man who in a 2003 New York Magazine article said this, and I quote, "I'd moved from communist to whatever I am now. I'm not even sure how to characterize myself politically. Maybe at some point I'll have to figure it out." If somebody admits they were communist and are not quite sure what they are now, they're unfit to be in the government. At the time he said this, he was in the government in the Department of Justice. If the system were functioning, James Comey, and for that matter, John Brennan, would have never been directors of the FBI and CIA, respectively. But that is an example of how corrupt and broken our system is. Let's look at operation number 3, coronavirus, COVID-19. Where did that come from? It came from a bioweapons lab in China. That's clue number 1. As I like to say, that's an investigative clue that we have a problem. And then what do we see happen? We see Democrats take the situation and turn it into something that becomes about controlling the state and power, imposing unconstitutional rules and regulations on people, and they get Republican governors to go along with it. And so now here we are months later with our civil rights, our unalienable rights of free movement, free expression being violated, our right to life because we're being told to do things that actually are unhealthy for us, like wearing masks everywhere we go, for those people that actually do that. Why? What do we know about this whole thing? Well, we know a few things. Close to 95% of people 70 years old and older have a survival rate. That's unbelievable. Of all the people in America, that is truly unbelievable. But we also have the hypocrisy of the leaders, which is more than just hypocrisy. People like Governor Cuomo in New York, Governor Newsom in California, Mayor Muriel Bowser in Washington, D.C., Denver's Mayor Michael Hancock, Steve Adler, the Mayor of Austin, Texas, and Mayor Lightfoot of Chicago, Illinois, who imposed draconian measures on their citizens and then, as you all know over Thanksgiving, leave and violate their own orders. Now, are these people just hypocrites? No, they're not. They are totalitarian agents of totalitarian ideologies. They are all about control of the state and power. They're not just hypocrites. That's why they're doing what they're doing. And again, folks, I want to make this very clear. The issue is never the issue. It is not about your health. It's not about COVID. It's not about climate change. It's not about racism or police brutality. It's not about any of that. It is about using the powers of government to restrict your unalienable rights. That's what this is all about. And that, my friends, is why we must fight. I'd like to close this little segment on the third operation, COVID, with this video, which features Dr. Anthony Fauci. And I think this video speaks for itself.
People should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
So let's look at Operation 4. What is Operation 4? Well, on May 25th, 2020, a black man in Minneapolis named George Floyd died while in police custody. What's interesting is that no film from the body cams came out immediately. We see that the police were accused of killing him, and simultaneous riots broke out immediately in dozens of American cities with pallets of water, milk, and bricks, pre-printed signs by the tens of thousands, some of which were printed by Hamas, doing business as the Council on American Islamic Relations. These are all clues that these were not spontaneous. This was a planned operation, launched by the communists of Antifa and the communists of Black Lives Matter. That's an investigative clue, folks. What we do know, once the body cam video came out, is that George Floyd was a dead man walking. George Floyd said while he was walking around the police car, "I can't breathe." And do you want to know why he couldn't breathe? Because he had enough fentanyl in his system to kill a horse. George Floyd was not the angel the media, the propaganda arm for the communist movement, said he was. He had a criminal record a mile long, including violent assault with a deadly weapon. And let's look at what some of these things were. We see violence. We see signs, "I can't breathe." Again, the issue is never the issue. And then from Jerry Nadler, one of the esteemed Democrat leaders in Congress, we get this.
There's violence across the whole country. Do you disavow the violence from Antifa? That's happening in Portland right now? There's riots.
That's a myth that's being spread only in Washington, D.C.
About Antifa in Portland?
Yes.
Sir, there's videos everywhere online. There's fires and riots. They're throwing fireworks at federal officers. DHS is there. Look online. It gets crazy, Mr. Nadler.
So here you have a member of Congress looking into a camera on the streets of D.C. lying. Jerry Nadler was lying. He said it's a myth that there's violence in Portland. He could be as dumb as a cinder block or crazy as a loon, but if he's like the rest of these folks, he is not. He knows what he's doing and he's intentionally lying. Why is he lying? Because there is a communist insurrection, a communist counterstate in the United States working to overthrow our government. And the agitators at the street level are Antifa and Black Lives Matter. So at the local, state, and national level, they are the ones who are doing violence to advance the political agenda and the broader agenda of this war for the communists, who are enmeshed, as you know, at the local, state, national, and international level with their Islamic counterparts. So let's take just a couple minutes, talk about Black Lives Matter. Well, we know their founders are communists. How do we know that? Well, they tell us.
I also think that it might, that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
Here's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, one of the 3 black lesbian founders of Black Lives Matter, Opal Tometi, hugging, smiling, and giving the power symbol with Venezuela's communist dictator, Nicolas Maduro. And as many of you know, what understanding the threat does is at the ground level, we are building ground teams to operate against these communist and jihadi movements. And we work with state leaders and national leaders when they'll listen and help them build a strategy at their level to win the war. But what was the next operation? The creme de la creme for our adversaries. It was taking down Donald J. Trump. Why? Because when Donald J. Trump got the nomination and became the candidate for President of the United States, the communist and Islamic movements lost their minds because they knew that he had the potential to break their backs. When he got elected and defeated the person they thought would be crowned queen of the takeover movement of our American constitutional republic, then they knew they had to go into high gear. And what did they do? They did all those things we just talked about. The Russia collusion lie and treasonous coup against the president, the impeachment, used COVID to control the state and power, the communist insurrection, the organized movement, that the violence on our streets that initiated by the death of George Floyd, and then the icing on the cake as they would see it, the top of their peak, stealing the presidential election. In mid-December of this year, 2020, we see that the DNI, Mr. Radcliffe, admitted that they know that foreign influence, including from China, had an impact on the 2020 presidential election. Now, I can tell you from direct knowledge that we have the forensics, the cyber forensics to show that foreign powers, including China and Iran, had access to this election, including some of the equipment. We know that traditional fraud was and has been discovered at an unprecedented scale. Everything from provisional ballot fraud, absentee ballot fraud, mail-in ballot fraud, all of this, creating fake ballots by literally, it could be in the millions, but we certainly know by the tens of thousands, which directly affected voting in key swing states. Now, how do we know that this was part of their plan? As we know, Democrats love to accuse others of the things they do. They are the party of the Ku Klux Klan, of slavery, of opposing civil rights legislation, yet they accuse others of being racists, when in fact they are. Why do I mention that? Because they do it about everything, but they tell us what they're going to do, they do what they're going to do, they do what they do, and then they accuse others of doing it. Who actually colluded with Russia? The Democrats. Who actually is working with China to bring down the republic? The Democrats. Prior to the election in June 2020, the Democrats, under the guise of a bipartisan product, produced the Transition Integrity Project. And if we look at who was a part of it, it is not a bipartisan group. John Podesta is in this group, as is William Kristol and Donna Brazile and Michael Steele. Now, Bill Kristol and Michael Steele have made their positions of being anti-patriots, anti-Donald Trump, and other things very clear. So they might be Republican in name, but this project was not bipartisan. This is anti-Trumpers, anti-Patriots putting together a project telling us what they were going to do in the 2020 election. And I just want to share a couple pieces of this with you. On the first page in the executive summary, they say this: we assess with a high degree of likelihood that November's elections will be marked by a chaotic, legal, and political landscape. Well, how in the world did they know that? They knew it because they were going to be behind it, just like they have been behind all these other operations to bring down the republic. And when we look at the findings of this Transition Integrity Project, we see among them includes the concept of election night is no longer accurate and indeed dangerous. So our enemies believe that the concept of election night is dangerous. You want to know why it's dangerous? Because when you say from 7 in the morning to whatever time at night you vote, and if you don't vote in that time, you don't get a vote, they consider it dangerous because the longer you keep the polls open, the weeks that you keep mail-in ballots allowed to be counted, the more they can print ballots and commit fraud to have their people elected. That's why it's dangerous. It's dangerous to them. It's dangerous to their power. It's dangerous to their successes. And by the way, as a historical side note, in America, we used to graduate people from the 8th grade and send them to university. And there was a lengthy written final exam that I suspect probably less than 5% of Americans graduating high school today could pass. And it was, in part, the communists and their efforts that extended high school from 9th through 12th grade. Why? Because they wanted more time with our children. Just a sidebar, something to think about and chew on in your free time. So back to the main story. Let's look at what Mr. Biden's strategic assessment is according to the Transition Integrity Project. Biden's strategic assets include Democratic governors and secretaries of state in swing states, notably in North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Here's a real kicker. Quote, a broadly shared sense in the Democratic Party that current voting systems as well as the Electoral College are structurally anti-democratic. Why does the Democrat leadership in America attack the Electoral College? Because they are attacking the very republic. The Electoral College is at the core of who we are. They understand that. That's why they're trying to destroy it. This Transition Integrity Project, which you can find online, we've mentioned it in several UTT articles. I encourage you to look it over because it was their plan prior to the election, and they're still following it. Here are just a few tidbits about the election we should probably keep in mind. At least 1.75 million votes are in question nationwide. We have over 900 sworn affidavits about irregularities and fraud being committed in this election. And what I think is incredibly important, bellwether states and counties were won by Mr. Trump. The vast majority of counties that are considered bellwether counties were won by Mr. Trump. States like Florida and Ohio were won by Mr. Trump. He got more votes than any other Republican in American history, over 74 million votes. He had literally over 1 million people at a recent rally in Washington, D.C. Joe Biden couldn't get more than a couple dozen people at his rallies, and we're supposed to believe he won, Mr. Biden won the election. It's preposterous on its face. But there's more. We already mentioned the forensic evidence of foreign interference, voting systems built for election fraud by individuals and corporations and entities hostile to liberty, i.e. voting systems built in coordination with Venezuela's leadership. You have in some areas like Michigan and Wisconsin, estimates of 150 to 300% overvotes. You have places like Philadelphia where you have voting over 90% of registered voters voted. Most election poll watchers will tell you that votes over 70% are questionable and anything over 80% is considered there's a fraudulent election. And of course, we've seen a number of real-world voting fraud cases prosecuted around the country, or at least investigations initiated, including in the 30 days prior to the election, per an article I wrote just prior to the election, 4 major fraud cases just in Texas alone. Why is everyone saying in the traditional media there's no evidence of fraud? Because they're lying, because they are the propagandists for the communist revolution and their Islamic State and Islamic Movement partners. But at UTT, understanding the threat, we have a victory campaign. We have a strategy, and we are executing this strategy in operations across the United States. Only understanding the threat empowers you, the citizen, the patriot, to get involved. And we cannot win this war without you. This war will be won or lost at the local level with you, the citizens, with you, the patriots. Come to Understanding the Threat at understandingthethreat.com and help us prepare you for this battle. Get in the war or fund the war. Get in the war by getting trained. Get into our Into Action program. That's the portal. That's the gateway to get you into this fight. We empower you with tools at the local level to build a ground team of patriots to identify, dismantle, and disrupt communist and jihadi networks at the local level. We give you tools to do all kinds of things very aggressively but lawfully. We give you resources. We give you intelligence. We give you support. We need you on the ground. If you don't want to get involved in that kind of way and you'd rather speak to people about the threat, teach people about the threat, hand out pamphlets, we can find and do have a space for you in our team. We need all of you to join Understanding the Threat in this fight. The time is now, friends. If you don't want to get involved in those ways, but you have the resources to fund the war, then we need your help to fund these operations. Understanding the Threat works with local teams, state legislators, local officials. We train police, we train local elected officials, and we work with national security professionals when we're able. We need your resources to do all of these things. Please join our Freedom 25 campaign. Donate between $25 and $500 a month, or if you have greater resources than that, please contact us at info@understandingthethreat.com. You can simply go to understandingthethreat.com and on our homepage, click the donate button and join us. Folks, we need you to get in this war or fund the war effort. The time is now. Join us as Understanding the Threat takes the fight to the enemy and puts freedom back on the offensive where it belongs.